Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulence, it's hard to keep track of them. This is Andy Revkin and the Sustain What webcast. And really pleased to be talking today with the author of a new book on a pretty fundamental question for people like me. What is journalism for? And hopefully it's a pretty fundamental question for consumers of journalism as well as those who are in this practice and have been for a long time or who are just beginning. Jon is a columnist, or he manages the media tracker at Columbia Journalism Review, which is a touchstone for anyone trying to keep track of the rapid changes in the media landscape beyond journalism, or within and beyond journalism. And he's written a book for Bristol University Press, which is part of a series. I didn't realize that until I was poking around. What is everything for? It's like everything you can imagine. And we are in a moment in time when things really are different than they have been for a very long time. For journalism, the challenges are just, again, adding up. The layers of challenges are stunning. The implosion of the practice, the domineering efforts of potentates here and elsewhere. And we'll go through some of that list. First of all, it's just congratulations on the release of the book, which I think you did in Perugia at the International Journalism Conference. And I'm sure everyone asks you right off the bat, what is journalism for? I've been, I'm reading the book. I'm not all the way through, but I've scanned it pretty thoroughly. And that kind of is a good starting point. And then we'll get into some of the details. And also joining us today will be Karen Bordelot, who's the executive editor of a local journalism operation in New Bedford, Massachusetts, that is demonstrating pretty powerfully in one particular dimension what journalism is for. So good to have you here, Jon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for noting that this is a series of books from Bristol University Press asking this impossibly broad question of all sorts of different societal institutions and things, because I sort of feel like people must think I'm insane or kind of grandiose or both to have taken on answering such a massive kind of existential question for journalism. But no, it is part of a series where these questions are kind of getting asked more broadly, and I was asked to write the journalism edition. So definitely insane and grandiose for taking it on, but maybe a bit less so than if it had been my idea. And yeah, it's funny actually, because I interviewed a bunch of different journalists for the book from the US, the UK, and Myanmar. And I would always ask, or usually ask straight up front, what is journalism for, as the kind of first question before, drilling into whatever aspects of it I wanted to discuss with that particular person. The idea being, not that they would give me a fully formed, kind of beautifully framed answer, although a couple did, amazingly, just sort of off the cuff. But I just sort of wanted to see where people's brains went, because it is such a broad question. And I want to be clear that I don't think there is one answer to it. Obviously, the book is my answer, right? But it is subjective, and it's it's ever changing. I'm sure if I'd written this book 5 years ago, it would be very different to how it is now, and in 5 years' time, maybe it would be completely different. But what I tried to do essentially is sort of two things. I think I tried to boil the question down to like three pillars that are, I guess, in my opinion, the essence of what journalism is for. And that is, one, to show good judgment, or to exercise judgment as to what is true in the world around us. Now, I think this might sound like a cop-out, and in some ways it kind of is, but I think it was Jay Rosen who once wrote that judgment is inevitable in journalism. It just sort of is there, and it's completely unavoidable. And I think also it's something that you can, hone, that you can practice, that you can sort of institute systems of checks and balances to make sure that you're exercising good judgment, right? Good editors, readers who you trust, sources who you trust, to these feedback loops. And it's a term that I sort of consciously chose over seeking the truth or things like that, even though it's very similar, because the truth is very difficult, right? And before you go out and look for the truth and try and communicate it, you have to make a judgment as to what truths you're going to go and look for. The stories don't just sort of sprout magically from the ground. You have to exercise judgment in every part of the storytelling process. So there's that. Secondly, this is, I think, the most important one for me, criticism. And this is not the idea of being, very negative about everything, but the idea of critically engaging with everything in the world around us pretty much all the time, just always asking questions of things, scrutinizing things, never sort of accepting things as sort of, fully answered and good enough. And the third pillar is, go ahead.
Well, no, go through the third pillar and then I'll ask a couple questions.
Yeah, the third pillar is community, which I think obviously is something that's very closely linked to journalism. And the way I see it is that journalism is sort of for a or multiple communities, be they geographic, be they communities of interest, ethnic communities, whatever it looks like. But always, I think, with the big caveat that all those communities are, especially today, but always have been, part of a wider world that shares the stakes in the same kind of existential global challenges, climate change obviously being foremost, arguably among them, or a top one. And I think that's important to stress, because I do think that sometimes news organizations serving a community can become sort of, could put barriers up against ways of seeing the world from outside that community, and I think that's not something we want. So it's about community, but it's about recognizing that the community is a sort of global concept, especially these days. And just quickly, before you ask me a couple of questions, those are sort of the three pillars, but I think what the book also tries to do is sort of ask what journalism is for in the context of a wider society, in the context of other institutions, rather than just sort of saying what journalism's kind of purpose in isolation is. What is its purpose like vis-a-vis the government, other civil society groups, things like that. I think where I sort of come down is that the journalism can have a quite expansive purpose. It can sort of step into things like service delivery, or sort of mediating negotiations or policy disputes within communities and things like this that some more traditional observers might say are not journalists' role. But I think where I come down is these things are compatible with journalism, and if you want to do them as a journalist, that's great, but they are probably not part of journalism's core purpose. And so, I think it's sort of a message to say that the journalists, and I think hopefully this is an important message at this time of sort of institutional degradation, can't do everything themselves, right? We're not the profession that can save the world, and that's probably not our sort of foremost role. The world needs us to do the things that I just mentioned consistently and well, and those are actually really hard and contentious and, difficult. So that's sort of the short issue.
And that what has become known as whataboutism gets a bad rap, but I found that people miss the importance of a kind of constructive version of whataboutism. I mean, the name of this enterprise I do, Sustain What, is a question, and we're if we just stick with phrases like climate emergency in my realm, or what's a migrant and what's a criminal, in other realms, if you're not asking questions that can kind of dive in and create more clarity, then you're missing something. So constructive questioning is a key part of it, I think, with that sense of pursuit of understanding, if not clarity. And I think it's a good time to bring in Karen Bordelot, because this is unfolding in real time for her and in many communities around the country, and places around the world, for that matter. Your book is international, and from Myanmar to the UK to the United States, etc. Karen, you're the executive editor of a brave and effective startup, the New Bedford Light, and you've just been shining light on this critical issue of what's happening under the Trump administration, with sort of pretty brutal examples of using extraordinary and sometimes violent means to bring people into custody, whether or not they're being illegally arrested. And
lawyer, federal agents detain.
Oh, sorry, that's the wrong. I wanted to click on the video. Just the last couple of days, your newsroom has been on top of this story. We'll just play this for a minute and then we can talk.
I can't reach it. It's up by her. Here you go.
No esperaron a que la abogada se presente.
So I'm going to silence it so we can talk a little bit. Explain what New Bedford Light is, how long it's been around, and you came to it through a long journey that started the Providence Journal, went to Arizona, I believe, and then came back to New England. So just explain that basic, and then we'll get to this particular story, which to me exemplifies one of the dimensions of what journalism is for.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Congratulations on your book, Jon. I can't wait to read it. It sounds exciting. So I'm just going to underscore before I get into this what Jon has been saying about the purpose of journalism. I think one of the things I really want to mention here is that I get all sorts of hives when somebody calls me the media. I don't respond to it. I think that journalism is a completely different part of the media. So I look at the media as this umbrella and journalism as a spoke to that. And it's very different from other kinds of media, so social, record, like music, all of that is media, but we are very different. And one of the things that we're different about is this sort of pursuit of facts, using data to support our stories, using public records to support our stories, and also holding people who are powerful accountable, particularly when it comes to, the government and the use of public money for whatever. So that's kind of what we do. This particular story sort of unfolded in the last 36 hours or so. And this is the wonderful thing about the New Bedford Light. So the New Bedford Light has a very good reputation here. We've been here for 4 years. Started as this very tiny nonprofit, sort of burgeoning. We have a wonderful CEO who's fiscally responsible. We have a lot of donors who support us, and that's really how we operate. We don't take advertising, and our content is free, so that people can see it. We have a great little staff who's just terrific, and one of them is a Columbia journalism graduate, Colin Hogan. So anyway, this is who we are. One of the things about the New Bedford Light that's different is that we go deep, meaning we go vertical in a story and not horizontal. And I think a lot of news organizations now are just trying to go horizontal and just, kind of writing off of press releases because there's not a lot of people in newsrooms anymore. We use our reporters differently. We use our reporters to specifically to deal with and to report on very specific topics like offshore wind, which is complicated, but our reporters fabulous on that. And housing and the fishery industry and all of these things. But our big topic this year has been immigration. We did a big project on it early on. One of the things that you will see here is our reporter, Geraldo, is from Chile. He speaks Spanish fluently, and people trust him in the community. And that is probably the most important thing about local journalism, is to have people who work in journalism, live in the community, and understand it. And he is one of those people who do. So he was able to get this because he's really connected to the people in the immigration community, and they trusted him. And that's how this started. So we worked with him, we edited, wrote it and rewrote it and published it, not last night, the night before. And it's taken off. And this isn't the first one. I mean, we've had many other detainment stories. One of them a couple of weeks ago, another reporter who speaks fluent Spanish and Portuguese, who's really involved in New Bedford and also trusted. He got a tip, and it was federal agents battering a door down with 2 14-year-olds getting ready for school. Right. In this. It's really something. It's pretty traumatic for everybody in the community. I can tell you, it's very stressful emotionally, I think, for our own reporters, but we got to do what we got to do. In showing this kind of thing, people should know this guy doesn't have a criminal record, at least in Massachusetts, which is where we were able to find. He's a young 29-year-old little kid trying to do the right thing. He's going through the process of getting his documentation in order, and this happens to people like that. So we needed to show it.
Right. So Jon, I'd love to have you weigh in on this. You were looking at this issue of well, you mentioned community. As a community, what's interesting to me is a community in the 19th century was your audience, and you still had your newspaper, even most of the 20th century. So you were doing stuff for the community, and then they would write 3 letters to the editor. And now community is part of the process. So just weigh in on that as it kind of relates to your book themes.
Yeah, well, funny that you should mention both New Bedford and the 19th century, because I feel like I've come dressed as a Massachusetts fisherman from the from Moby Dick or something.
You're doing a good job. That's good.
I completely by accident. Yeah, so I think what you say is absolutely right, and obviously, the way journalism sort of intersects with community has changed over time. And I really try and be quite critical about this idea in that chapter in the book. I think the idea that journalism serves a or many communities is still true, but I also think it can kind of become a cliche or a truism. Well, we're here to serve the community, and how do we do that better? And that's great, but I think there are some things that need to be sort of thought through about it. And yeah, one is this idea that whereas in the past you might have had a very kind of close and, as you say, somewhat limited relationship to your community, right? Like you would be a newspaper that would potentially be the main or even only source of news for people in your town, and they would, if they wanted to have their voices heard in the public sphere, but maybe the best way for them to do that would be to, as you say, write a letter to the editor. Now, obviously, that's not completely the case anymore. We have, a profusion
Right.
of voices. And I think that brings challenges, obviously. But I also think it can bring opportunities as well. The fact that I can go online and within 5 minutes find out what's going on in, New Bedford, Massachusetts, for example, and I can see that video of something that is like so visceral and important. I mean, obviously, in 1890 or even 1990, I would not have been able to do that in anything like the same way. So you do actually have access to information about things that are going on in other communities. And I think that's really important because, as I say in the book, it's really, really important that community news does serve a community. It is rooted in that community, but doesn't sort of draw up or accidentally reinforce boundaries between communities. And that can sound kind of abstract, but, in Myanmar, for instance, which I write about quite a lot in the book,
Right.
there were lots and lots of allegations that otherwise good kind of independent news organizations were during the Rohingya crisis. If you guys remember that in the sort of late 2010s, I mean, that sort of iteration of what's been a longer term crisis, were just actually in terms of the very basic building blocks of the language they were using, sort of othering Rohingya people, refusing to actually use that word to describe them, using language that sort of described them as outsiders, really sort of reflecting the very ingrained sort of prejudices of their readers or even people in the newsroom kind of back at them. And these
Right.
were news organizations which in many cases were doing otherwise good journalism, and have rightly been held up then and since as sort of examples of a kind of flowering independent media. So that notion of community can become difficult. And I think that actually, again, there are challenges in this world where there's so much noise. How do you reach people? How do you make sure that your community is seeing information that's important to them? But I also think that, this kind of globalization of information, reinforces the idea that, again, this is kind of a global community that we're all in. Communities exist within bigger communities that all overlap. And I actually think the story that that Karen's organization has done and that you were just talking about is a great example of that, right? That's a story that is about both a national and an international policy issue that involves other countries, but that plays out on the ground somewhere. And I think for me that sort of models what the kind of relationship between journalism and community should be about. There has to be a sense of place, a sense of who you're primarily writing for, but also a sense that it's part of a bigger patchwork, and that in this information age you can get that out to people. I sort of happen to think, and maybe we'll come on to this, that the much bigger problem is actually kind of on the supply side, and how do we pay for this type of information at scale rather than necessarily the demand side so much. I think there is a demand for it. So and I think when you can sort of again get that type of information out beyond your community, it can be really powerful, even if me sitting in London is not the sort of primary audience for it. I'm still an audience for it. I still need to know about it in some ways. And I think it's a powerful example.
Yeah, and let's talk briefly about the business model question. You said you have substantial donor population, et cetera. And one thing I worry about always is how to make sure this possibility exists in communities that need it the most. And New Bedford, as you said to me this morning, I think it's 40% immigrant population or people who speak a different language, maybe primarily, and you have which is a reason to tune your journalism to their
Right.
interests and to have a
It
reporter who
absolutely
speaks
is.
the
And
language.
to not just to tune the journalism in there, but to make sure that the journalists represent that area. And so,
Right.
we're doing that. And that's one of the reasons why we get the calls. This is happening because they know us. And that, that really is kind of the model, at least the journalism model, not the financial model, but the journalism model of the 70s. I mean, it's been around a long time. I've been actually a journalist for almost 50 years, which is kind of scary, but it is true. And so that sort of, when you're in the community, and all of our reporters live in the community, when you're in the community, they know where to find you. I mean, you can't escape them. You're trying to buy bananas, at the market basket, and somebody is pointing to you and saying, hey, you know what I don't like about what you guys just did, or you know what I like? And you have to be responsive. So I love that. I started my career in that, and now I'm here again in it. And I really love that. I think it's the connection, and it's an important one. And it's just, so the financial model is a little different here. It is really based on foundation money and donations. And we have some very generous donors, which is terrific. Some of the foundations are also also very generous and funding a lot of these other startups. So we're sort of further along than probably, I would say, most people in this sort of grassroots kind of sprouting things. But if you look at Massachusetts, they're all over the place around Boston. They're in Newton, they're in Brookline. We have Plymouth Independent. I mean, they're coming up all over the place. And so, we'll see, we're early in the game here, but it is a light that we haven't seen in journalism in a long time, because it's been on the decline. And now we're just starting to see seedlings, and I love it. And I'm really hoping that we can make it work.
So, Jon, talk a little bit about the themes that cut across the reporting you did and the inquiry you did through the different countries, Myanmar, UK, and the US. And then we're going to get into the countercurrents, the things that are making this all really hard. That what is journalism for may lose meaning if journalism kind of goes away, and we end up in this morass of, as Karen said, just media where you can't discriminate what's quality or not. I know you mentioned, obviously there's pressures on journalism that are pretty similar everywhere. The book came out before or you turned it in before Trump, the second coming of Trump, but those themes are already pretty clear even in the first administration. So what comes across in the list of things that make journalism flourish and then that don't?
Yeah, I think I should stress that it's not a sort of like academically rigorous cross-country kind of comparative politics or whatever type book. It is an academic publisher, but it's a commercial book. So it's not like I'm saying here are things that make journalism in Myanmar different to journalism in the US, and it's kind of schematized. It's not really like that at all. For me, what was important was I am a British person from the UK who did journalism school in the US and still write for US media, so I've sort of been steeped even in those two journalistic cultures. And it was important for me writing this book, because I think you do see a lot of work along these lines become quite particularly US centric but very Western centric, to sort of have a counterexample in there that, again, was not to say this is representative of the world beyond the West or the rest of the world or whatever, in kind of essentialist terms, but to say there is a world beyond that, and here's kind of what's going on there. And I chose Myanmar because I'd written about it a little bit before, but it's actually just an incredibly fascinating country from a press freedom and press perspective. I mean, they actually have an extremely kind of long-standing and rigorous indigenous culture of press freedom, actually dating back to the sort of early and early sort of British colonial period in the 1800s, that then was sort of crushed after the war because there was this long period of military rule, and then there was this sort of hopeful transition towards democracy in the 2010s that was far from perfect, but did see a flowering of independent media compared to what there was before. And then in 2021 there was this terrible military coup. Loads of media sort of had to either go into exile or journalists, quite a lot of journalists quit journalism, but many carried on, and then many new people sort of sprung up as citizen journalists. And there is some amazing work being done by those outlets and by journalists under just incredibly difficult conditions. Definitely one of the worst countries on earth for press freedom, makes what's happening in the US look quaint, frankly. Just a sort of completely maximalist censorship situation. And I think what I found, one thing I was interested in was, is there going to be a different sort of journalistic culture there? Is there a different answer to the question of what journalism is for there to what you see maybe in the US or the UK, beyond this kind of idea of people in the US can't even agree on the answer to it, right? People in the UK can't. So It's not, I didn't expect to find the sort of monolithic answer, but are there other things that come up? And, I think I should be honest about the shortcomings of this. I'm not an expert on that country. I don't speak any sort of native languages, and I'm sure that I spoke to a good number of journalists from there, but they were all people who spoke English and who I think would be the sort of people who probably have put me in touch with each other. Within that, I did try to speak to a range of people, but these people I think who are very exposed to sort of Western journalistic culture, however you want to define that. Very, very often they are people who are deeply engaged in kind of trying to get grants from Western donor governments and sort of big donor organizations, which have obviously, hew quite closely to what might be a sort of traditional US philosophy of what journalism is. And so, I don't claim this, again, this is kind of a scientifically rigorous sample, but I think what you see come across is that there are, some very sharp questions posed by the conditions they're working under around, what is an appropriate amount to sort of be activist against this government that is just a military dictatorship. And then on the flip side of that, do you sort of become closer to the many sort of armed organizations that are fighting back against that government? Essentially, you sort of share a goal, which is a restoration of democracy that allows for press freedom. But obviously, these are political actors. In some cases, they might be committing abuses of their own, or at least not transparent. They're political actors at the end of the day. So how do you sort of balance that? I think that's a question that clearly is being asked in the US in some sense, but is very differently. So it's very different in that climate. That the stakes are a lot sort of more a lot more immediate. I think there are outlets that have sort of been journalists who've been quite explicit that they are sort of activist journalists now. They are kind of fighting against the junta. There are others who say the junta, by virtue of wanting to eliminate us, are essentially making us fight against them. It sort of turns journalism into an active resistance, even if what you're doing would be kind of considered objective under other conditions. So I think the sharpness of those, of the climate in which this is all playing out definitely does heighten some of these questions. But I think at the same time, you still see questions like this going on in the US, albeit maybe at a lower scale, right? Like, what is the appropriate extent to sort of quote unquote resist? If a government starts picking on you, are you sort of inevitably in a war with them? Marty Baron, of course, famously said, "We're not at war, we're at work." I have more recently disputed that, just purely in the sense that if someone starts a war with you, then you sort of are at war with them. Even if you are just at work, right? The work sort of becomes a war. Again, similar themes to what you're saying in Myanmar, but it's sort of a different context. I think sort of where I come down on this generally is that, broadly speaking, I heard the same sorts of answers from people in Myanmar as in the US and the UK, with again these local variations for context, but people very much sort of saw journalism as about telling the truth, getting the truth out to communities, holding power to account, scrutiny, those sorts of things. And I sort of back this up, and I think you just had it on screen, with some information from the Worlds of Journalism survey, which is this big, as the title implies, survey of the world of journalism, asking journalists all over the world how they sort of conceive of their roles. And I think it's quite a textured, thing where in some countries in the developing world, maybe sort of economic development might be seen as more of a raison d'etre for the press than democracy, but equally those things are not mutually exclusive. And I think you had this quote up, but there is sort of a sense that, journalists all over the world, to varying degrees, do see holding power to account, having a kind of, having that kind of function within society, telling the truth as being just like completely integral to what they do. So I think there is a sort of broad global definition, but obviously there's a ton of like messiness and complexity within that I try and get into a little bit in the book, but it is obviously quite a short book and a very big world. So it's tough,
In the section, in the section on Myanmar, you also talk about social media, the how that became a prime driver of some horrific problems, and it gets to this issue of this, what is journalism for? The importance of somehow conveying to people in ways that they can ingest and act on, and then ultimately, for example, to support journalism. It feels like it's a losing battle in the sense that the Facebooks and the X's of the world are already sort of dominating in so many ways, and journalism is at best playing catch up always. So talk about how that played out. I mean, I'm showing this picture from your book with Obama with, this was a Nobel Prize winner where things went in a very different direction in a hurry, and how that relates to the bigger issues of sustaining the public consciousness around the value of this thing called journalism.
Yeah, I'd say that I sort of see this two ways. And just to start with the sort of Myanmar context, after a period of just being a very closed information environment, one that did always have journalism, I want to be clear about that, often sort of, in exile, and it would be sort of broadcast like over the radio, and people would sort of covertly listen to the radio in their house in the 1990s. This definitely was a thing. It wasn't like just a totally closed environment, but very, very restricted. In the 2010s, just underwent this extraordinary kind of transition to people having phones and internet, right? I mean, again, internet access has been a sort of ongoing story there, but Facebook kind of absolutely exploded to the point where it became, I think it's fair to say, an absolutely crucial source, or at least platform for news. I have I quote this in the book, I think, but in Myanmar, sort of traditionally, people have met in tea shops to share gossip and information and opinions. And I think Facebook, at one point has been referred to as the digital tea shop, right? It's sort of subsumed quite a lot of that function in the digital age. And I think obviously there were tremendous opportunities with that for discourse and for informing people and all the rest of it. At the same time, as I'm sure many of your viewers will know, Facebook was accused of kind of throwing gasoline on the Rohingya genocide, as it has been characterized by many observers, in the late 2010s, essentially by allowing hate to flourish on its platform and sort of become an area where intercommunal violence was stoked. There were figures associated with the military and sort of radical extremists using Facebook to kind of gin up hate to massive followings of people, including against journalists sometimes, I believe. And so, it turned out to be this double-edged sword. And Facebook has subsequently said it could have done better, I believe, or at least commissioned some investigation that suggested it could have done somewhat better. I haven't read it, but I think I've seen some discourse floating around from this new book by Sarah Wynne Williams, a former Meta staffer who has got some very sharp things to say about the company to do with this. But they've essentially been accused of kind of extremely lax content moderation, just throwing this kind of radically transformative informational product into a society and not really having any guardrails to sort of police how it was used. So I think there's two things here. I think one is that, this explosion of information technology is going to have inevitably good effects and bad effects. It is going to make sharing information easier, but it's also going to make sharing disinformation easier. It's going to make it easier for people to come across journalism that, as we said earlier, in the past might have just been a local newspaper for 2,000 people, but also, going to make it easier for people to see tweets and Facebook posts saying it's fake news and spreading lies about the owner, right? I think there is an extent to which it's inevitable. There's then the secondary question, though, of the actual digital architecture that we have, which is, of course, so dominated, and this is obviously a big story this week with the FTC trial and Meta, so dominated by these big platforms that are, not totally unaccountable, but essentially unaccountable, I think, that are driven often by the sort of whims of one or a very small group of people whose algorithms are totally opaque, and who, as we saw very tragically in the context of Myanmar, I think it would be unfair to say it was their fault that this happened. The sort of wider violence, clearly it's a lot more complicated than that. Just do not have consistent policies for how to deal with it when hate and hate speech and disinformation starts to kind of rampantly spread around. So And that I think is something that we do obviously need to do something about, right? Like, and this is a huge problem for journalism, because these sort of essentially these distribution channels for what we hope are good and truthful information are just controlled in undemocratic and completely opaque, more or less completely opaque ways. And it is possible for journalists and journalism to sometimes kind of surf on that and game that system, but it's not primarily set up for the sharing of kind of nuanced, truth-based, difficult, detailed, substantive stuff. It's clearly set up in many cases, and again, as we saw in Myanmar, to hypercharge hatred, oversimplification, lies. So yeah, it is, I think, a messy space that is always going to have downsides and upsides. But yeah, the way it actually is kind of constructed globally is very bad, and something, that it would be nice to do something about.
And Karen's back in the conversation here too. And now one thing you mentioned earlier, and thinking about community and journalism and serving communities, including specialties, one of the challenges now is that in the media environment, we all used to consume some information communally, like the nightly news, Walter Cronkite going, "That's the way it is," back in 1982, the last time he did his broadcast. I grew up with that. Karen grew up with that for sure. And now it's just this big, so instead of that comfort food we have this buffet of whatever you want. And Fox is serving a community and doing pretty well at it, but it's a community, and the service of the community is creating a sort of hyper divisions. I don't know if that plays out, Karen, in your arena, in New Bedford. Is there, how does that work?
I kind of want to speak to that sort of on the national level. I did look at some of your points that you were making about the threats to journalism, and I've given those same speeches myself. So whatever they are, the AI and the misinformation, disinformation, media illiteracy, distrust of the media, all of that kind of stuff. But when we're talking about those things, it's, I think, more than anything, that misinformation, disinformation, I mean, we have to work on that. And for so long, for decades, and Andy probably will agree with us, the journalists, the newspapers, we were sort of in our own little, bubble, and, we did what we did, and we disseminated the morning paper, and we didn't really explain to people how we do it, how hard it is to actually do investigative reporting, how many resources it takes. We didn't tell them anything. And so I think that's a job that we have to do now. It's kind of like, we're really late to our own game, explaining this stuff, so that, somebody who just takes a tweet and just throws any information out there is so not us. It's so different from what else is out there. And I don't think we've done a very good job of it. I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have in journalism, is not being able to, or not having had to explain ourselves before. And the next one is exactly what you guys were talking about, with this sort of division, especially on the, and I'm going to say lowercase, cable news networks, really since the early 80s, let's just face it, these are 24/7 cycles. They have to feed the beast, and it doesn't matter to me whether it's MSNBC or Fox or CNN or any of them. They're feeding the beast. And one of the things that you're seeing when you watch these things is a lot of opinion on there, and it's mixed with news. And how do you expect the average person who doesn't have a journalism degree, who can't differentiate, think that it's anything but news, right? So even when you interview people, that lower third, it might be up there for 10 seconds, and it tells you that this guy's, the executive director of a conservative think tank, or the executive director of a liberal think tank. And then it goes away, and you think the average person, whatever they're hearing, they just think that that's real, that's factual, but it isn't. And that's, I think, one of our biggest problems. That has really happened over the last 40 years. And we haven't done much about it. We haven't explained that to people. So I think those are the things that I see. And I think in my world now, and at the New Bedford Light, we don't play any of those games. We are really reporting on these very specific topics, and we're going very deep on them. And we get a lot of great feedback on those. If we didn't have you, we wouldn't know, what was going on. And that's the biggest compliment
that does say.
Yeah.
John, that feels like that sort of answers that question. I mean, it kind of excites me to think that people start to understand the value of journalism when they feel that value. That's expressed through your book for sure, and you also get into the history of these different kinds of journalism. There's so many things under that bundle: opinion, crusading, yellow, muckraking, and there is no general way to. It's important to understand what's in people's heads when they look at this, and the decline in journalism trust, which is pretty well documented.
Although at the local news level, not so much.
Well, there you go. Right.
You know, it really, if you look at the last numbers I saw, maybe were a year or two ago, but they're still probably true. The Pew, I look at Pew numbers sometimes when I'm doing a speech or whatever, but the last ones I saw were people who were over 30 years and older. 70% of them still had trust, you know, a lot of trust in their local news outlets, which is great. I mean, wish it was 100%, but it's 70 I'll take. And it was the national news that kind of had like lower numbers. They were in the 50 percentile. The bad news, that was the good news. The bad news is that young people under the age of 30, they think they just sort of look at it all together. So they don't know how to differentiate necessarily between, like, you know, vetted journalism and what's on social media. They look at it all the same. So so that's the problem that we have to solve.
So, John, I know your book is academic press. It's a short book. It is definitely for the average reader, though. And do you have much hope that this kind of understanding of journalism can extend beyond the little bubble of people like us, and maybe a few layers beyond?
Please say yes, John. Please say yes.
Yeah, no, I do. No, I do. I really do. I was going to say, I have sort of, I think, slightly different and quite complicated views about some of this stuff, which is definitely not to say that I am, you know, right about it. I think I just sort of come from, you know, my sort of journalism, and this book in particular is quite philosophical. It's very sort of like, you know, from 50,000 feet, and totally, you know, defer to Karen in all things sort of, you know, serving a community and local. And I think everything she's saying is definitely true. To texture it a little bit, I think that sometimes media trust metrics can maybe be a little bit misleading. And I think that actually what Karen is saying about the local figures being higher tracks for me. I think part of it is when you have sort of more direct contact with something, when something is reporting on things that are in your sort of direct lived experience more than something that's going on miles away that you know nothing about, you obviously have a sort of more innate ability to tell whether that reporting is trustworthy and accurate or not, right? And I definitely sympathize with this idea that at the national level, there's a lot of division peddlers and people sort of trying to juice an audience for outrage. I mean, I think all of this is clearly true. I think with the national media, the sort of two caveats I would issue maybe are, number one, that I think a not insignificant part of the erosion in trust is from, it's just the result of political attacks, right? I mean, these are the outlets that are really in the sort of crosshairs of very widely publicized political attacks on behalf of what is a political movement that has decided to weaponize attacks against the press. And that's definitely not to say that the press has not been complicit in the erosion of trust in itself, which I definitely do think is a real thing. I think that Trump and his ilk are kind of cottoning on to something there that already exists, but they have, I think, massively amplified it and made the problem much worse. I also think that when sometimes in these surveys, when you ask people, do you trust the media? Someone who actually does have a pretty healthy media diet might think and I think this comes to your point earlier, Karen, about the broadness of this term, they might think, well, I don't trust Fox News, I don't trust Breitbart, so I'm going to say, no, I don't trust the media. And then this can sometimes be spun up as like, trust in the media as a whole is collapsing. And actually, it's a very diverse place. And maybe, some of the more granular data on this, which exists, is maybe better. I think it definitely does paint a picture of declining trust overall. I'm not saying it doesn't, but I think there are nuances to this. And that sort of brings me on to my second point here, which is, that I definitely think it's very, very important. And I think briefly in the book, I think we really need sort of better media literacy teaching in schools and for young people around this kind of thing, that people can kind of become critical news consumers, that they can see when information has just been made up or has been, rigorously reported. And as Karen says, I think news organizations are starting to, but could still do more to sort of be, I think, radically transparent and open about the way they do things. I think also, though, that like these categories, what is news, what is opinion, what is reporting, what is sort of outrage, sometimes it's very clear to see the difference, but I think it's more a spectrum than a sort of, hard and fast situation, right? Like,
Yes.
Yeah, a sort of reported AP news article is going to look quite like a reported news article, and a Fox News diatribe is a Fox News diatribe. But in the middle, is an analysis piece news or opinion, or does it have a bit of both? I personally think some of the best opinion writing, and I hope I sort of try and do some of this myself, is based on reporting, right? You go out and you talk to people, and then you say, well, here's my point of view, and here's how this sort of textures it. So these things are difficult. And I think that in a world where there's so much opinion and so many voices are heard, I sort of have hope that while it may not express itself in sort of traditional metrics, that younger people do actually sort of have quite an innate understanding of the information ecosystem that is somewhat sophisticated from sort of living in it, right? Like, I don't necessarily, like, I think there's definitely a problem with how do we get enough news in front of those people that is sort of like fact-based, rigorous, expensive journalism, and how do we pay for that? And I think that again is a very, very largely a problem about funding journalism generally, when people either don't want to pay for it or can't pay for it at scale, and also sort of making sure that it surfaces on social platforms that we don't control. I think there's definitely huge problems. And I think that, people who use these platforms don't see enough of it, and there is increasingly less and less of it to go around. Big problems. But I think that, people who grew up in this information environment are probably sometimes more sophisticated than we might think about navigating it. And to come back to your sort of initial lead into this question about, Cronkite in the news. Yeah, I think on the one hand, you can look at that and say that was a more unified sort of information environment. People generally consumed, or at least the sort of information they mostly had access to in these kind of big mass media platforms was sort of truthful, vetted journalism. You could also make a case that that was a view of the world that, while factual and reported, was sort of funneled through a quite establishment, white perspective, for example. And you could say that this sort of explosion of different voices on the internet has been, in a sort of small d sense, democratic. It has allowed people to sort of challenge narratives that they think are wrong, to sort of do almost reporting from on the ground, right? Even if they have a point of view about it, they can say, well, this is going on in my town, I'm going to share a video to TikTok. So this is where the hope comes from, is I think there's generally the demand for fact-based new information about the world is pretty perennial, actually. Like, I think it's just part of the human condition. And I think that when you hear about people not consuming it now, I think often that people are consuming it just in ways that are maybe less direct than they are paying us for it, which is a big problem. But I think that is really the name of the problem, right? Like, when people listen to Joe Rogan, a lot of it is not about politics or current affairs, and a lot of it is very dubious. But he and others are still sort of discussing, things that reporters are reporting, things that are in the New York Times. Right-wing media types are very often, in fact, reacting against things they've read in the mainstream media, which is still a form of talking about it.
Right.
And you see influencers on TikTok these days who sort of essentially will just swallow like an article from a newspaper and say, oh my God, guess what's happening, guys? And that sucks in the sense that it is essentially parasitic. And again, I think this is why the real problem is, how do we pay for this stuff and who pays for it? But it is not, what it is not is, a younger generation that has no access to facts about the world and news, or has no demand for that. I think that there is that demand. I think it's pretty consistent, but I think it's changing. And I think this is a moment where all this is up in the air. And that's why it's just very, very difficult to know exactly where we're going to come down. It will require much smarter people than me to figure it out en route. But yeah, I really think that demand is there. And I think we're in a moment of flux more so than like total death. But along the way, things are going to die that are important if we don't figure out how to pay for them. And that is a big problem. So I don't want to be seen to be minimizing things or having like a sort of too optimistic a gloss on this. But yeah, that's my sort of general hopeful take. I don't know if that was hopeful enough for you, Karen. I hope so. But
well, I think Karen's operation is demonstrating it too.
Yeah,
I just want to point to a couple other examples. When I was covering Hurricane Helene in Carolinas from a distance, I was not able to get down there, as many people weren't, unless I glommed onto Mark Honeycutt, who is He's a YouTuber who's mostly does YouTubing about paragliding. He's from that area, Western North Carolina, that was hammered. And in those first days, he became a truth teller. He got past all that ridiculous lying that was going on in social media about thousands of bodies and, making dubious claims about FEMA work. And he was in the field. He went to these areas that were unreachable, hiking, and he was practicing the practice of journalism. I think he's mostly back to his YouTubing now, and he gained hundreds of thousands of views, if not millions, for his stuff. It still was swamped, I think, overall by the, at least online, by the other stuff. And I think that gives me hope.
Right. If I may just
very quickly.
Yeah. I was in the International Journalism Festival in Perugia last week, and I was at this panel that was sort of about, I think the title was "All Journalists are Content Creators and We Should Embrace That." And I guess, like, literally, I think that's true. I don't actually think it's true in the sense that a content creator in the modern sort of parlance is someone who has a very wide following and is often able to kind of monetize that and do nothing else. And I don't think many journalists are that. But, this panel had some who are, who have millions of subscribers on YouTube, or who are trying to kind of work out a business model for this. And I think that's where the challenge is, right? It's like, how do you scale this? Not everyone who works even at the New York Times could jump over to social media and become like an individual sort of star reporter who makes enough money from that to make that work. And that's like the New York Times. I'm sure, Karen's organization, which serves a much smaller audience just by dint of, being a local outlet, your reporters could not sustain all becoming these kind of lone wolf people who all have, even 5,000 or 6,000 Substack subscribers and who are all paying, right? So what this sort of panel was about is, how do you scale that? And what I thought was so interesting is there was this YouTuber there called Johnny Harris, who is really popular. And he was sort of talking about how he was at Vox, and then he kind of started out independently, and he was just making videos, and it's journalism, but he likes making videos. And over time, he sort of hired researchers and producers. And he was sort of saying, and someone asked basically, like, doesn't this just mean you have a media company? He was like, yeah. Someone I spoke to the other day was like, you're describing your business and you're describing a media company. You've started a media company. And he was like, I never thought of it in those terms. But I guess that's what I have done. And so this is the thing, right? It's like the point of having sort of organized professional newsrooms is it's a way of scaling the production of this information. I think that is like a very, very large part of the challenge. Not that it sort of doesn't exist or there isn't a demand for it. It's just sort of working out how to like organize that and have an infrastructure behind it in an information ecosystem that is kind of individualized and fragmented. And that, I think that is really tough.
Karen, I'd love you to weigh in on this one more time, but there's one other example I want to show, which is an international journalism project that's been underway for almost 20 years called Global Press, based in DC. But all the journalists are women, and they're all from Rwanda or from Pakistan or from the countries they're covering, sort of like what you were describing in New Bedford. Mm-hmm. And they have a business model that's being sustained. It's still supported by donations. Their work is published in various languages, including their languages in where they are located. They have a great practice of how to use language and not avoid and to avoid misusing a word like refugee and the like. And I did a conversation with them when USAID was being shut down by Doge. I did a conversation with their reporters who are on the ground in Uganda, in this case, doing the work and finding some way to have a networked support system for distributed local reporting feels to me like it would be a smart thing to do. There is Report for America here, which I think is done.
We've actually had a Report for America, a reporter. In fact, Report for America, the beginning of that is a New England person. I mean, who started it. And,
interesting.
He now owns and publishes the Martha's Vineyard Times. And his son, because we're all the same family. His son worked for us until October, when he went off to write a book on the fishing industry. So, and this organization here, one of the founders of this organization is a very good donor to us. So it's all part of the same family, but yeah.
So there is a possibility of that. I think Report for America is an example. I did a conversation here a few years ago with them, I think when the pandemic was raging. It sounds like there's a lot of promising possibilities. I want to show you one more slide that I think I glossed through too quickly earlier. It's a little depressing, but it does show you. This answers one of the questions one of you brought up earlier about conveying the value of journalism. Mike Baker, who's a New York Times reporter, had posted this tweet that now there are 41,550 journalists in America and 280,000 public relations people. That was this year. And it got me Googling around to find the supporting data. And a guy who used to be at one of the big PR houses, Rubenstein, et cetera.
1 to 7 or something like that.
Who did this 2024 essay on LinkedIn where he's like saying, we need journalism, and he's a PR guy. He says, given more layoffs, fake news, and misinformation will more easily find new homes. Propaganda of a sort will prevail. The PR business will serve more than ever as a shadow media, acting as a puppeteer, a Wizard of Oz masterminding public perception, secretly behind a curtain to win hearts and minds. And it's kind of devastating. It's a vital read. It's on the post I did about our show today. And
but again, I'll weigh in on this one because I have also worked in public relations for a couple of years. So I understand that side of the coin a little bit more. And yeah, of course, there are all of these, you can point to any profession, doesn't matter if it's priest or police, there's always going to be, the bad one. Okay. But you know what? Public relations is not necessarily bad. I just think that people need to understand there's a difference, that they have a perspective. They're giving you information through a prism. They're trying to make their president or whomever, look better than maybe they even are. But I understand that, I think journalism, I'm not worried about us not being able to figure that out or whatever. It's sort of okay, great. You got your perspective. Just let us know what it is, and, we'll link to your full quote or whatever it is, but it doesn't impact our reporting. We just understand the prism that they're operating through. And I think everybody should be able to, to know that there's a difference. So I'm not worried about that, but I do want to bring up one thing. I think that this goes back to what Jon was saying earlier about, this is particular to President Trump, but it's not like he's the only president to ever have done this, although he is definitely the one on steroids doing it. This, I think your readers would like, or your. His answer, I do it to discredit you all and demean you all so that when you write negative stories about me, nobody will believe you. I think that's the playbook, and I just think we need to know it.
Yeah. Well, Jon, I'd like to give you the last word because we're at the end of an hour and you're in the UK and you had something that you have to drop off for. So just circling back to the book, is there a last prime takeaway we haven't discussed that you think needs to be conveyed?
No, I don't know I think we've sort of discussed it in great detail. I'm very thankful to you and also to Karen for discussing it with me in such smart terms this evening in my time. I would reiterate, I think that I have a pretty flexible definition of journalism. I think these categories, as I was discussing earlier, between news and opinion are quite broad. I think that we are in a moment where, I think we need to sort of conceptually dissociate journalism from what goes on at major journalism institutions. Not to say that isn't journalism, it obviously is, but we're in a moment where news consumption habits are radically changing. The internet is upending everything, and journalism isn't just going to live on in those types of sort of institutions that we're used to. I think it can and will look different, and as I said before, I see hope there. I guess what I feel strongly is that again, despite this flexible kind of definition, and despite the fact that I think journalism can sort of take many forms that sort of do things that are functions beyond what we might traditionally conceive of as journalism, what society really just does need journalists to critically evaluate the world around them and present factual information or analytical information or whatever, but rooted in fact about it, that is new and timely and reflective. And that is very much what journalism is for. I don't think the other stuff is. I don't think the other stuff is what journalism is for in the same way. even if I think it is compatible with journalism, it's not journalism's job to necessarily provide it. And so I think, yeah, at a time when so many other institutions are failing and there are so many people who seem to fall through the cracks of society and things are not necessarily kind of going great on a global scale, as a journalist, I don't think you should feel kind of guilty or that it's your job to like fix that. It isn't. Journalism needs help and support from people around it. And this isn't to say that journalists, shouldn't aspire to change the world in some abstract sense, but it is to say that usually sort of changing the world in big like macro ways is very much beyond your control, right? In the 70s, the Washington Post could do Watergate and the president resigns. Now the president says what Karen just said, I'm actually just going to make it so that people don't believe what you said and screw you. It doesn't mean that your journalism is worse than the reporting that brought down Nixon necessarily. It just means that the accountability incentives have changed. And actually, by the way, this is a total aside, by the way, but like I think there are ways that Watergate, having looked into it, could have played out very differently where Nixon didn't resign, and actually that's kind of contingent as well. So it's not even like necessarily as clean as saying in the 70s the president definitely resigned in disgrace when you disgraced them, and now they just don't. But that aside, I think you got to sort of. I think everyone should understand that journalism has a purpose that is divorced, in my opinion, from the impact that you can kind of see it having in the world or how people vote or whatever. And I see a lot of sort of hand-wringing and despair that Trump won and we told people, that Trump was a threat. And so no one read our journalism and it didn't matter, for instance. Well, I think that's a faulty analysis because Trump won by a very slender margin for starters. But again, I think it's also arrogant to assume that people who voted for him didn't read and consume what you wrote. They just may not have been the most important thing for them, or they may not have agreed. And yeah, there are people who are blind to it or not consuming it, or who think that you're scum and everything you say is fake, and that's a huge problem. But I don't think that's everyone by any means. I don't think it's actually really anywhere close to a majority of people. I think it probably is a scary number of people, but it's not like this is not like 90% of people, even though the Trump administration is currently behaving like it is. Yeah. Journalism is sort of one input in a wider world. There are other institutions that need to do their jobs, and sometimes the work can feel thankless, but actually, usually it is making at least someone more informed or making that person feel differently about the world or changing their mind about something. These are not small things. They are a source of like real value in itself. And yeah, for all the challenges that we've talked about today, I think that we shouldn't lose sight of that just because we feel that things that we may believe or hope for are not happening at a kind of macro level. We're not the only ones in this ecosystem. And as long as we do our jobs, and again, I'm much more worried about the money and the supply side of it than the demand side of it. I think we've really got to figure out as societies how we pay for this information in ways that are not what we're doing now, despite the fact that, projects like Karen's do exist and are doing great work. I think clearly there's a scale problem here. Yeah. But the actual demand is there and the work does matter. I really believe that, even if it's hard to measure.
That's great. Do you have like 2 more minutes or do you got to go?
I have 2 more minutes.
I want to play one little thing that Jay Rosen told me in the early days of the pandemic, which happened to be the run-up to the 2020 election. And he kind of asserted there needs to be an emergency mode for journalism. And there's a lot of that right now, a lot of that same discussion. But I seem to think that what Karen is doing is the best sort of answer to that question. But here's what Jay said. And
I think we're facing the biggest propaganda moment in modern U.S. history
from now
until November, because there's so much out there in the public record that only by preventing Americans from understanding what happened from December to March can he possibly win the election. And I don't think the profession of journalism or the media system as a whole is in any way prepared for that.
And I think, looking at where we're at now with the second term, it feels that discussion is happening. He was calling for so many changes that haven't really happened. We still are stuck in a he said, she said political framing around the things. Is there an emergency mode for journalism? And what does it look like to you two? We'll just go with Karen quickly and then close out with Jon one more time.
I think we're in a pretty critical place. I just think that there are solutions to that, and I think some of the solutions is to better inform people about what journalism is and what it isn't. I think that's number one. But I also think that, we're just going to keep doing our jobs, just going to keep providing you with information that has context to it. That's what we do. And it may not, at least in New Bedford, have an impact on a macro level, meaning international, but it certainly has an impact on a micro level.
And John?
Yeah, I think I very often agree with Jay, and I'm sure I would have done around the time that he was saying this, and probably last year as well in some respects. And I think that I've written very often about Trump coverage, probably more so than anything else. And I think there are certainly a lot of things I could and would say about sort of proportionality and urgency, and also just sort of basic framing and language choices around him, where it can feel like there's this sort of desperation to treat him like any other politician, certainly in the context of like elections where it's him against someone else, where you can make that kind of direct comparison when he is very different. And I don't personally think it really betrays any bias to say that. He just is. I think that words that could sound very sort of negative and opinionated, apply to him factually because he sort of incarnates those qualities. I also think to some extent we're past that now, right? I think he is in, and the things that people like me warned about are happening or are going to happen. And so it's like emergency mode, in the sense that I think all news organizations at every level should be thinking very, very carefully, how do we defend our people and how do we defend our work against this kind of barrage of threats that we are starting to see come. And I don't think we're seeing the worst of it yet, sadly. But at the same time, in terms of like how that manifests in coverage, I don't necessarily think that like it's sustainable to have a 5-alarm fire for 5 years. I think that the best thing to do is just to report as accurately and truthfully as you can, and to not shy away from language that seems difficult or divisive if you think it is the truth. And that goes back to my point in my book about judging the truth. I don't think it's about having like, Anderson Cooper screaming on CNN and sort of trying to say, this is so important, why won't you listen? I think we're past that stage. Although I do sometimes think that, I think that proportionality and comparative urgency still matters, don't get me wrong. And it drives me crazy when I see coverage of like who's up and down in the 2028 presidential sweepstakes, taking really any oxygen at the moment, given how far away that is. But I think it's more about actually just doing the work that is factual and trying to get it in front of people. And this story, which we were discussing from the New Bedford Light, is an example of that, definitely. And I think there's loads of work like this going on, actually. I think that, I've sort of asked, how do you sort of see journalism through a media critic's lens in this kind of Trump 2.0 era? And I think a lot of people are very frustrated with a lot of it. And my answer to this is, I think you see a lot of the same mistakes that people have been making the whole time, but I don't think these necessarily reflect like a newfound fear or self-censorship. And actually, I think that if there's a direction of travel, it's more in the direction, I would say, and again, generalization is hard, but like it's probably more in the direction of the sorts of outlets and reporters that I was frustrated with kind of getting it now, because it's happening and they're seeing it and it's not hypothetical, right? They can see these sort of very real kind of challenges to the rule of law and civil liberties that are going on. And I think that, people are getting it and doing good work. I now think there is a new problem, which is squishy editors and owners and executives who are either cowardly or greedy or some combination, who are not people I'm going to trust to stand up for their people. But, and again, I'm definitely not saying there's like a clean bill of health across all of this journalism. Like, I'm sure as a media critic, I'd find a lot wrong with it. But generally speaking, I think that like people are doing the work, the reporting is out there, and people are generally speaking getting it, actually. So, and I don't know if we need to sort of enter an emergency mode for that to be the case. I think it's going to be a long 4 years and maybe more, who knows. And there's a huge amount of news to cover. And I think you've got to sort of pace yourselves, allocate your resources, effectively cover the stories you think are the most important in language that tells them plainly and the most honestly, even if that feels difficult. I think that for me is where the challenge is, not sort of some imagined kind of like hair on fire screaming mode, is my opinion, basically.
Well, thank you both so much for your time. It's precious, and there's lots of work to do. And I think that idea of sustained work, iterative, innovative. I noticed that Andrea Pansera, who works with you at New Bedford, mentioned that this is out on TikTok, etc. You're sort of probing different ways to engage different communities. Your website has multiple languages, obviously. Same thing with global press, as I mentioned earlier, on the international scale. Publishing in Nepali for Nepalis and English at the same time for the rest of us. So keep at it, keep at the innovation, including the financial possibilities. You mentioned that. I'd love to find that YouTuber you mentioned, John, who was at the journalism conference, who's now got a quote unquote production company, etc. That's happened a lot on Substack with people like Matt Nicolaisis. So Thanks again. And everyone should look at this book, What is Journalism For? Bristol University Press. It's easy to find. Google your way to it, and definitely look at New Bedford Light, not just for the New Bedford details, but for how it resonates outward as an example of what we can do elsewhere. This is Andy Revkin. Sustain what is my interrogatory approach to navigating the kinds of terrain we see around us every day now. So thanks again, and good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hold on one second.